I always thought that my shadow was just a simple dark shape that followed me everywhere. It was the same as everyone else's, a part of me that copied every move I made. But one ordinary day, I noticed something very strange. My shadow was not acting like it should. It was doing things that didn't match what I was doing. And that was just the beginning of a story that would chill me to the bone. It all started on a gloomy fall afternoon. I was walking home from school along our quiet, tree-lined street. The wind was low, and the sky was covered in thick, gray clouds. As I walked, I noticed that my shadow stretched long on the pavement in the soft light of the setting sun. At first, I didn't think much of it. I had seen my shadow all my life, and it always looked the same, dark, solid, and perfectly attached to me. But today, something was different. I stopped at the corner of my block to tie my shoelace, and when I looked down, I saw that my shadow did not stop with me. It lingered on the ground, like it was waiting for something or someone. I blinked a few times, thinking that I was just imagining things. I told myself that maybe the light was playing tricks on my eyes, or maybe I was just too tired from a long day at school. I quickly tied my shoelace and hurried off, trying to push the strange feeling aside. That evening, when I got home, I tried to forget about what I had seen. I sat down to do my homework in my room, but my mind kept wandering back to that odd shadow. I looked out the window at the darkening sky, and then at my own shadow on the floor from the streetlight outside. It looked normal, just a dark, blurry shape, but I couldn't shake the memory of it lingering at the corner. I went to bed feeling uneasy, and I couldn't sleep for hours. The next day, everything seemed to go on as usual, but I kept watching my shadow. At first, it was subtle. I noticed that when I walked slowly, my shadow sometimes seemed to be a split second behind me. Or sometimes it even appeared to be in front of me before I took the next step. It was like it had a mind of its own. I tried to tell my friends about it during lunch at school, but they just laughed and said, "That's silly. Shadows always follow you exactly." I wasn't sure if I should laugh too, or if I was the only one who felt something was very wrong. Over the next few days, I became more and more aware of my shadow. I began to write in a small notebook every time I noticed something odd. I described how, when I stood still in the school hallway, my shadow sometimes stretched longer than usual, as if it were trying to reach something. When I ran across the playground, it would move with a little delay, like it was waiting for me to finish running. And sometimes, when I looked in a mirror, I saw a shape that didn't match my own movements at all. It was scary, and I felt like I was being watched by something I could not see. One rainy afternoon, as I was walking home from a friend's house, I took shelter under a big oak tree. The rain made everything look blurry, and the puddles on the sidewalk reflected my image. When I looked at one of the puddles, I saw my reflection move normally, except for my shadow in the water. My reflection's shadow rippled and moved in ways that didn't match mine at all. It was as if it was doing its own dance, twisting and turning in the water. In that moment, my heart pounded, and I felt a chill run through me. I hurried away from the tree. The image of that strange, moving shadow burned in my mind. At home that night, I sat at my desk and tried to work on a history project. But every time I glanced at the window, I caught a glimpse of my shadow on the wall outside. It looked normal at first, but then it would twitch or shiver as if it were alive. I began to feel that something wasn't right. I couldn't sleep that night because I kept thinking about the way my shadow had behaved in the puddle and on the wall. I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, wondering if my shadow was trying to tell me something. The next morning, I decided I had to learn more about what was happening to me. I went to the small town library after school and looked through old books and newspapers about strange occurrences. I didn't find much at first, just a few stories about ghosts and legends that people told to scare kids. But then, hidden in the back of an old book, I found a mention of something very similar to what I was experiencing. The book talked about a shadow spirit that sometimes attaches itself to people who are carrying deep secrets or heavy memories. According to the story, the shadow would act on its own, and try to reveal things that the person was too afraid to remember. I wasn't sure if I believed in such things, but the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to fit. I remembered the time when my family lost our old dog, and the long nights when I felt completely alone in my room. I recalled moments of anger and sadness that I had kept hidden, locked away inside me. Could it be that my shadow was showing me those feelings? Or maybe it was something else. Maybe it belonged to someone who had never found peace. That night, I decided to face my fear. I sat in my room with the lights off, the only glow coming from a small lamp on my desk. I stared at the wall where my shadow lay, dark and still. I took a deep breath and whispered, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" I didn't know if anything would answer, but I had to try. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, I saw the shadow stir. It started to move in a way that was not like me at all. It stretched and then contracted, and I felt like it was almost breathing. My heart pounded, and I felt a mix of fear and curiosity. I asked again, "Who are you?" The shadow did not speak, but I swear I heard a faint sound, like a soft sigh, echo from the corner of my room. I felt tears prick my eyes, not from sadness, but from the terror of feeling that I was not alone. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like hours until I finally managed to tell myself that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The days that followed were some of the most difficult of my life. I no longer felt safe even in my own home. Every time I passed a mirror or a window, I caught sight of that strange shadow moving on its own. Sometimes, it would even look at me with what I thought were sad eyes. I felt like it was trying to show me something important, something that I had forgotten or didn't want to remember. I began to feel a deep chill inside, a shiver that went right through my bones every time I saw it. I started to record every detail in my notebook. I wrote down the time, the place, and exactly what my shadow did. I noted the times when it lagged behind, when it moved ahead, or when it seemed to dance on its own. I even started drawing pictures of it in my notebook, trying to capture its strange shapes and odd movements. With every entry, I felt like I was piecing together a secret that had been hidden for a long time. The more I wrote, the more I began to understand that this wasn't just a trick of the light. It was something real, and somehow, a part of me. One chilly evening, I was walking home from a friend's house along a deserted street. The wind howled softly, and the street lamps flickered as if they were about to go out. I could see my shadow stretching out in front of me on the wet pavement. As I walked, I suddenly noticed that my shadow stopped moving at the same time I did. I turned around quickly, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was no one there. I looked down at my feet and saw that my shadow was still there, standing perfectly still for a few long seconds before it finally began to move again on its own. My heart raced, and I quickened my pace, feeling as if I was being followed by something I couldn't see. When I finally reached my house, I bolted the door behind me and locked it. I sat in my room, too afraid to move, as the memory of that moment played over and over in my mind. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my shadow acting strangely, and I wondered if it was trying to tell me something about my past or my future. Days turned into weeks, and the strange behavior of my shadow only grew more intense. At school, I began to feel isolated. I couldn't concentrate in class because I was always thinking about what my shadow might do next. I started to feel like I was losing control over my own body, as if my shadow was a separate person altogether. I even began to wonder if I was imagining the whole thing, that maybe I was just too tired or stressed to see things clearly. But every time I looked in the mirror, I saw it, the dark shape that did not move the way it should. One afternoon after school, I decided to confront the mystery head-on. I went to the park, a quiet place with old benches and large, shady trees, and sat on one of the swings. I looked down at my feet and watched my shadow on the damp grass. The wind blew softly, and for a few moments, everything was still. Then, slowly, I saw my shadow begin to move by itself, sliding off the edge of the swing and creeping toward the dark part of the park. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I felt a strong urge to follow, even though every instinct in my body told me not to. But I needed answers. I had to know why my shadow was doing this. I got off the swing and followed the dark shape as it moved away from me. It led me down a narrow path lined with old trees whose branches looked like skeletal hands. The deeper I went into the park, the quieter it became, until all I could hear was the sound of my own footsteps and the faint rustling of leaves. My shadow moved ahead of me, and I hurried to catch up with it. It wasn't long before I reached a small, hidden clearing. In the middle of the clearing, the pavement was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and there was an old, broken statue covered in moss. I stopped in my tracks and looked around. There was no one else in the clearing, and the silence was overwhelming. I looked at the statue and then at my shadow, which now seemed to be standing right next to the broken figure as if it were guarding it. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this place held a secret. I walked closer to the statue and noticed that it had an inscription, worn away by time. The letters were hard to read, but I could just make out the words. Remember the past, do not let it fade. A sudden gust of wind made the leaves rustle, and I could almost swear I heard a soft whisper. I leaned in closer to the inscription, feeling as if it was trying to speak to me. The shadow beside the statue seemed to twitch, and for a split second, I thought I saw a pair of eyes glimmer in the darkness of its form. I took a step back, terrified and confused. Was this my shadow, or was it something else entirely? I couldn't tell anymore. That night, I lay in bed with my heart pounding, replaying the events of the day in my mind. I remembered the inscription on the statue, and the message it carried made me wonder if my shadow was connected to something long forgotten. Was it trying to remind me of a secret buried deep in my family's past? Or perhaps a tragedy that I had never known about? The thought made my stomach twist into knots. I decided that I could not live in fear any longer. I had to find out the truth behind my strange shadow. I began asking questions at home, talking to my parents about old family stories. I learned that my great-grandfather had been a quiet man who carried a heavy sadness with him. They said he had lost someone very dear to him many years ago, and that he had often walked around in the evenings, as if he were searching for something. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if my shadow might be connected to his long-hidden pain. Determined to learn more, I visited the town's small history museum the next weekend. I spent hours looking at old photographs, letters, and documents that told the story of our family's past. There were hints of a dark secret, a lost love, an unsolved mystery, and even whispers of a curse. Although nothing was written directly about a shadow spirit, I couldn't help but feel that the strange behavior of my shadow was linked to these old stories. It was as if my shadow was a living reminder of everything that had gone wrong in the past, trying desperately to be heard. Every night, as I lay in bed, I became more aware of the eerie presence that followed me. I started to feel as though my shadow was not just a part of me, but a part of someone else, a person who had been forgotten and lost in time. Sometimes, when I was alone in the dark, I could almost see faint shapes moving in the corners of my eyes. It was as if the night itself was filled with memories, and my shadow was the messenger trying to bring them back. One particularly stormy night, when the rain pounded against my window and the wind howled like a pack of wolves, I woke up to a strange sound. I sat up in bed, listening intently. The sound was soft at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder until it seemed to fill the entire room. I looked around, and in the pale light from the street lamp outside, I saw my shadow on the wall. But this time, it wasn't just standing there, it was moving, slowly and deliberately, as if it were trying to break free from the shape of my body. I felt a surge of fear and excitement all at once. I called out, "Who are you? What do you want?" My voice trembled, and the whisper in the room seemed to respond. "Remember me." The words sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't understand how my shadow could speak, yet I was sure of what I heard. I felt trapped between the desire to run away and the need to know more. The storm outside raged on, and in that moment, the line between reality and nightmare blurred. I lay back down, too frightened to move, and listened until the sound faded into silence. The next day, I decided to talk to Mr. Jenkins, our old school janitor, who is known to know many old stories about the town. I found him sweeping the school courtyard during a quiet break between classes. I hesitated at first, but finally, I asked, "Mr. Jenkins, have you ever heard of a story about a shadow that does its own thing? Not the shadow that follows you exactly, but one that sometimes lingers or moves on its own." Mr. Jenkins stopped sweeping and looked at me with kind, tired eyes. "Ah, you mean the old legend," he said slowly. "They say that long ago, when this town was first built, there was a man who carried a great sorrow with him. Some folks believed that his spirit lived on in his shadow, and that it would appear when his heart was heavy. No one really knows if it was true, but sometimes, on cold, dark nights, people say they've seen a shadow that acts on its own. It is a reminder of the past, a secret that refuses to fade away." His words both frightened and comforted me. It was as if he confirmed what I had been feeling all along. My shadow, I realized, might be trying to tell me something important, a message from the past that I needed to remember. That evening, I went back home with Mr. Jenkins' story echoing in my mind. I sat at my desk and opened my journal. I wrote about everything I had experienced, from the strange lagging of my shadow to the eerie whisper on the stormy night. I even drew a picture of the statue in the hidden clearing and copied the worn inscription as best as I could remember. "Remember the past, do not let it fade." As I wrote, I felt a mixture of fear and determination. I knew that I had to keep searching, even if it meant facing the darkest parts of my own history. Weeks passed, and my encounters with the strange shadow became more frequent. I began to notice that on days when I felt particularly sad or angry, my shadow would behave more erratically. One afternoon, after a fight with a close friend, I walked home in a heavy rain of tears. My shadow seemed to split into two for a moment, one part clinging to me and the other drifting away as if it were searching for something. I stopped in the middle of the street, drenched and shaking, and watched it closely. I could almost see a face forming in the drifting part of the shadow, a face filled with pain and longing that wasn't mine at all. I started to feel that the shadow was not my enemy but a messenger. It was showing me that I needed to face my own hidden feelings, to confront the past that I had buried deep within me. Every time I saw it act in such a mysterious way, I wondered if it was trying to guide me to the truth about my family's old secrets and my own forgotten sorrows. One cold, foggy night, I decided to follow my shadow again. This time, it led me to an old, abandoned house at the edge of town. I had always heard stories about that house. It was said to be cursed, a place where strange things happened. The house was dark and silent, with broken windows and a creaking door that seemed to invite me inside. My heart pounded in my chest, but I knew I had to be brave. I stepped through the door, and as soon as I did, my shadow slipped ahead, disappearing into the gloom of the long, narrow hallway. Inside, the house was filled with dust and memories. I could see old photographs on the walls, and the air smelled of forgotten time. I followed my shadow down the hall, my footsteps echoing on the creaky floorboards. It stopped in front of a large, old mirror that hung on the wall. The mirror was cracked, and in its reflection, I could see not only myself, but also a figure standing behind me. I spun around quickly, but there was no one there, only the dark, empty room. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, a dark shape with eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 unspoken words. I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and fear all at once. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, and the shape in the mirror flickered. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a familiar face in that shadow, a face that reminded me of the old family photos and the stories of my great-grandfather. I whispered, "Who are you?" But again, there was only silence. At that moment, I realized that my shadow was more than just a part of me. It was a part of my past, a part of the memories that I had tried so hard to forget. It was the living reminder that I could not escape the pain of old sorrows, and that sometimes the most important secrets are hidden in the darkness. I left the abandoned house that night with a heavy heart, feeling both terrified and strangely comforted. I knew that I had to continue my search, to piece together the fragments of my family's story and understand why my shadow was trying to speak to me. Over the next several months, I made it my mission to learn everything I could about my family's history. I talked to relatives, looked through old letters, and even visited the town archives. Slowly, I began to uncover the story of my great-grandfather, a quiet man who had suffered a terrible loss. He had loved someone very much, but that love ended in tragedy. Some said that he had lost his mind, and others whispered that his sorrow was so deep that it never left him. I started to wonder if the strange behavior of my shadow was connected to his unending grief. Late one evening, while I was studying old family records at home, I heard the familiar whisper again. "Remember me?" I turned around, and there it was. My shadow was moving on the wall behind me, swaying gently as if beckoning me closer. I felt my heart hammering in my chest as I walked over to the wall. I placed my hand on it, and for a brief moment, I felt a warmth that I hadn't expected. It was as if a long-lost memory was trying to reach out to me. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I remember. I will not forget." From that day on, I began to accept my shadow as part of who I was. I still felt fear when it acted on its own, but I also began to see it as a guide, a silent reminder that the past, with all its pain and mystery, was a part of me. Whenever I felt lost or alone, I looked to my shadow, and I remembered that I was not just my present self, but a collection of every memory, every sorrow, and every hope that had ever touched my life. There were still nights when I couldn't sleep because the sight of my moving shadow made me shiver with fear. I would lie in bed and stare at the dark shapes dancing on the ceiling, wondering if they were echoes of a sorrow I had yet to understand. But slowly, I learned to listen to the quiet messages that my shadow sent me. In its silent language, I began to see the outlines of old wounds and forgotten dreams. I learned that sometimes, the scariest parts of our lives are the ones we hide in the dark, and that facing those parts can be the first step toward healing. One chilly winter night, when the wind blew hard and the snow piled high against the windows, I sat by my small desk, writing in my journal by the light of a flickering candle. Outside, the world was silent except for the soft crunch of snow underfoot, and inside, my mind was full of questions. I wrote about every strange moment I had experienced, the way my shadow sometimes moved a little too quickly, the way it seemed to linger when I felt sad, and the mysterious whispers that I could barely hear over the sound of the wind. As I wrote, I began to feel a strange calm come over me, as if the act of remembering was helping me understand the secret that had been buried for so long. In my writings, I described a moment that would forever be etched in my memory. It was a night much like this one. I had been sitting in my room, feeling lost in the darkness of my thoughts, when I heard the soft voice again. "Remember me," this time. I did not feel fear. Instead, I felt a deep sadness, as if the voice belonged to someone who had suffered greatly. I rose from my chair and walked to the window. There, in the pale light of the street lamp, I saw my shadow standing alone on the wall. For a long moment, it remained still, and then, as if it had reached a decision, it moved slowly toward the door. I followed, my heart pounding, and opened the door to the cold night air. In the silence of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My shadow was not attached to me anymore. It was standing by itself, its edges blurred as if it were melting into the darkness. I reached out a trembling hand to touch it. And at that moment, I felt a rush of cold air and a sudden wave of memories that were not my own. I saw flashes of a past life, of sorrow and loss, of moments when someone had cried out in despair. And then, as quickly as it had come, the vision faded, leaving me standing in a silent hallway, my breath visible in the cold air. From that night on, I began to understand that my shadow was more than just a part of me. It was a connection to a time long ago, a reminder of a pain that had never truly been healed. I no longer feared it in the same way. Instead, I began to see it as a messenger, one that urged me to face my deepest secrets, to acknowledge the hidden parts of my heart, and to remember the people and moments that had shaped who I was. The mystery of my shadow became a part of my daily life. I learned to watch for its subtle changes, the way it would sometimes move just a little too fast, the way it would linger when I paused, and the way its edges would shimmer in the dim light. I even began to have quiet conversations with it, whispering my worries and hopes as I walked home in the early morning mist. There were times when I felt like my shadow was listening, as if it understood the burdens I carried. One crisp spring evening, as the sky turned from pink to a deep, velvety blue, I found myself walking along the same quiet street where it all began. I paused on a small bridge over a slow-moving stream, and as I gazed down at the water, I saw my reflection and my shadow together. But then something extraordinary happened. As I stared at the water, my shadow began to ripple and change shape, forming outlines that looked almost like words. I leaned in closer, trying to decipher the message. The shape swirled and eventually settled into the simple phrase, "Never forget." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, not tears of sorrow, but of understanding and acceptance. It was as if my shadow was telling me that all the pain, all the secrets, and all the memories were a part of me, and that I should embrace them rather than run away. That moment on the bridge changed everything. I no longer saw my shadow as a strange, alien part of me, but as a loyal companion that carried the story of my life, even though it sometimes moved in ways that sent chills down my spine. I realized that it was a reminder of the strength I had inside and the journey I had taken to learn about myself. The more I understood, the more I shared my story with others. I started writing down my experiences and even telling them to a few close friends who I trusted. Some of them admitted that they had noticed odd things too, a flicker in a mirror, a shape in the window, or a sudden chill that made them feel like they were not alone. Together, we formed a small group that met once a week to talk about our strange experiences and to support each other. It was comforting to know that I was not the only one who had faced the unknown, and that sometimes the mysteries of life were bigger than any one person. There were still nights when fear crept in, when the whisper of "remember me" echoed in the silence, and I felt a shudder run through my body. But now I was braver, because I knew that every mystery had an answer, even if that answer was hidden deep in the past. I started to see that my shadow was not trying to harm me. It was trying to help me heal. In its quiet way, it urged me to face my hidden memories and to let go of the fear that kept me from truly living. Over time, my relationship with my shadow changed completely. I learned that even though it sometimes did things that were hard to explain, it was a part of me that reminded me of everything I had endured. I began to accept the idea that some parts of our lives are mysterious, and that we do not always have to understand every little detail. Sometimes, the mystery is what makes life interesting and helps us grow stronger. Now, when I walk home in the early morning light or stand alone in a quiet room at night, I look at my shadow with a sense of calm and understanding. I remember the days when I was afraid of it, when every strange movement made my heart race and my mind fill with questions. I remember the long, lonely nights and the painful memories that I had kept hidden. And I know that my shadow, with all its odd behavior, is a gentle reminder of those moments, a reminder that I have lived, felt, and grown. Even now, sometimes my shadow still does things that I cannot explain. There are moments when it lingers a little too long, or when it moves just before I do, as if it already knows what I am about to do. But instead of being scared, I smile and say quietly, "I remember." I have learned that not every mystery is meant to be solved right away. Some mysteries are part of who we are, and they guide us in unexpected ways. So, I carry on with my life, always keeping an eye on the dark shape that follows me wherever I go. I write down every strange encounter, every eerie whisper, and every bone-chilling moment when my shadow seems to live its own life. I share my story with anyone who will listen, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it will help someone else remember their own forgotten past. And on the nights when the wind is cold and the world seems too dark, I whisper back to my shadow, I will never forget. In the end, I have come to accept that the things we cannot explain are sometimes the very things that make us who we are. My shadow, the one that didn't belong to me at first, became a part of my life, a constant reminder of the secrets and memories that shape us. It may be strange and even a little scary, but it is also a symbol of the past that has made me strong, brave, and ready to face whatever the future might hold. I still get chills when I think back to that first day on the corner when I noticed it lingering behind me, and I shudder when I remember the whisper on the stormy night. But now I know that every step I take, every moment I live, is a part of a larger story, a story written in light and shadow, in laughter and tears, in fear and hope. This is my journey, my truth, and my promise. I will always remember the past, embrace the mystery of my shadow, and let it guide me to a future where I am no longer afraid to face the darkness. Even if my shadow sometimes moves on its own, I know it will always be with me, a silent friend and a keeper of memories, reminding me that I have truly lived and that I will never forget. And so, every time I see that odd flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, I no longer run in terror. Instead, I stand still, take a deep breath, and let the whisper echo in my heart. Remember me, for in those quiet, eerie moments, I am reminded that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in every shadow, every memory, and every heartbeat. I share this story with you now in the hope that you, too, will learn to listen to the quiet messages around you, that even when things seem strange or frightening, there is beauty in the mystery, and strength in the courage to remember. My shadow may have started as something that didn't belong to me, but over time, it became the guide that showed me the truth of who I really am. Now, whenever I walk under a sky painted with twilight or sit alone in the stillness of a quiet night, I feel a comforting presence by my side, the presence of a shadow that is both mine and so much more. It is a part of my life's puzzle, a piece that fills in the gaps of my past, and a reminder that every secret, every forgotten sorrow, and every hidden hope is worth remembering. I will always remember, and in that memory, I find the strength to face each new day, knowing that even the strangest parts of us can lead us to the light. As I continue down this winding path of mystery and memory, I realize that life is a series of moments, each as fleeting and yet as permanent as the shadow that trails behind us. It is in these moments of quiet introspection, when the darkness speaks in hushed tones and the past reaches out with ghostly fingers, that we learn who we really are. My shadow, with all its strange and bone-chilling ways, is a part of that lesson, a reminder that nothing in life is ever truly lost, and that sometimes the most ordinary things hide the deepest secrets. So now, whenever the night grows dark and the wind carries a familiar whisper, I stand tall and let my shadow move as it will. I know that it is a part of the tapestry of my life, a mix of light and dark, hope and sorrow, memory and mystery. And as I move forward, I carry that knowledge with me, forever grateful for the strange, silent companion who taught me to remember. I will never forget the lessons learned on those lonely, chilly nights, and I will continue to write my story, one step, one shadow at a time. For in the end, even the things that seem the most frightening can become our greatest guides, if only we are brave enough to listen. This is my story, my truth, and my promise to myself, and maybe to you, too. Remember the past, embrace the mystery, and always, always listen to the whispers of the dark. I will remember.